This is my film, A Tangled Tale, which was released in 2013. It is a film made with sand animation, but there's also a lot of compositing and digital effects applied to the footage to get this underwater, colorful world, which is very atypical for sand animation. So I thought it'd be nice to perhaps dissect a scene, and you can have a look at all of the After Effects work that went into creating a scene like this. So we're sort of going to go through these layers and take a look at how the scene is constructed. So there's a lot going on in this scene. We have the animation of the fish. We have the fishing line that the fish is stuck on. There's also this underwater environment that I was creating with the plants moving back and forth and things floating in the water, little bubbles, and a lot of textural elements. And I was really kind of going for sort of a semi-sense of depth, but also that multi-plane animation look. So let's take a look just at the individual assets that are in this scene. We can look at the footage that I have collected over here. So first I have a hold that I created, and this is just a cycle of the fish in place that I can then keyframe in After Effects to have a little bit of drift, because it's much easier to let the computer do very, very slow movement rather than trying to replicate this exact shape of the fish as it's moving very, very slowly across the screen. And so there's that, and then there is a sequence of shots of the fish swimming. As you can see, there is that hold, and it's sort of drifting across, and then the fish starts to swim. You know, this was all part of the same shot, but I did the cycle first, and then I animated the fish breaking out of the cycle and then swimming away. And then there is another section of this swimming where the fish comes back on from the bottom and then sort of like goes off the screen. And so I've put those layers together in a composition and timed it out and done some keyframing on the hold, so the fish is drifting across the screen and then it swims off. And what I have around this is I have what's called a garbage mat. Let's see if I turn this mask off. What you can see is that there's a little bit of like residual sand that's left in the corner here. And that stuff I just didn't want to have distracting in the frame. And so creating this little mask around the fish allowed me to just get rid of that. Now, the other thing, of course, you'll see in this is that there is the fishing line. And so that was added after the fact. I essentially put together, I edited together the sand animation, exported those frames, took them into Photoshop, and then rotoscoped them by drawing in the fishing line. And there's a couple parts in this fishing line where we have some really slow movement. Instead of trying to draw that super precise with like really close in-betweening on ones in Photoshop, what I ended up doing is having one nice line with the pencil texture that I was using. I've actually used the puppet pin tool to manipulate that, the shape of it very, very slowly. Again, using the strengths of the computer, which can do very precise in-betweening, to overcome things that I personally am not very good at. That gives us this really nice sort of slow movement, which when the fishing line is moving faster, I just sort of abandoned that and drew it because there's a lot more forgiveness in fast movements than in slow movements. Okay, so that has gotten us to this point where we have the main bit of animation that we're working with. And so we have that all in one composition. What's next? Okay, so here's that composition that we were just looking at. And what I have added is I've added a few additional sand bubbles that I've made just for environmental effects here. Some of them are a little bit timed to the fish's movement, but some of them are just sort of like rising up from the bottom of the riverbed or lake bed or whatever you want to call it. So what these compositions look like is that there's just a lot of these assets that I have created. So here's one, and you notice it's going across the screen. That's because I wanted the most pixels to work with, and then I could just rotate that. It's just a slowly evolving grouping of 3. Let's see what else we've got in here. We have one called A Single Bubble. And this, I believe, is just a cycle. Okay, so cycle with some texture around it to give it that sort of morphy feel to it. Let's see, this one's just kind of like a cycle of some splotchiness. So what I've done with those assets is I've just started grouping them in different ways to make several different compositions that I can recombine in different ways to make the more complex groups of bubbles that you see in some of these pieces here. So it's just a matter of multiple combinations of different bubbles. Some of them are timed to the fish's movement. So if we get back to here, we start to see that some of these have been built around the fish's movement as though the fish was creating them. And then they've sort of been nested into that composition. So we've got the fish, we've got the bubbles surrounding the fish. Now let's talk a little bit more about the environment. So we have here another composition that actually has quite a bit of complexity in it as well. Let's go through some of this stuff here. So we start off with just this grainy background texture here, and this is just sand sprinkled on the light table, and I actually have 2 different images, just still images of them, and I'm cross dissolving in between them. You can see that this is it's like a 10-second cross dissolve, so it's very slow and subtle. You really wouldn't even notice it, but what it does is it just gives it a little bit of variation in the texture, so it doesn't feel totally 100% still. On top of that, we have a layer of plants, and so this was also created just by throwing some sand on the light table and photographing it. Once I have this image, I started applying a variety of effects to it. Primarily, if we solo this, I think you should be able to see the mesh warping. This was timed to the movements of the fish because I wanted the fish to be causing the plants to move as it swam by and to have that movement. But then also when the fish is not affecting the plants, there's this very slow movement back and forth like they're drifting in the currents. That's also another thing that the mesh warping really was helpful for, because there's absolutely no way that I could have moved these shapes without completely destroying the beautiful texture that you get just from kind of like throwing the sand onto the light box. And also there's no way that I could have moved them slow enough to really replicate a underwater feeling. Let's show the mesh. There it is. Okay. So again, this is 2013. Things have come a long way since then. And this was one of the new things that After Effects had come up with, and it was really great to work with. I tried to keep the polygon count, as low as I could, just because it was, there's a lot of pixels to manipulate, and it really was challenging for my machine at the time. I'm sure that there's a whole lot more that you could do now with the updates to After Effects' great puppet tools and mesh warping tools. So what this really allowed me to do, though, was to keyframe individual pieces as the fish was swimming by. And that way I could get sort of a staggered timing that indicated how the fish's body might be brushing up against the plants. Okay, so here you see we have the plants, we have that grainy background texture. I'm going to turn this off, and let's go back to our next composition up. Okay, so here's what we were just looking at, right? And then on top of that, there is another composition that has some color effects. And this is when I was starting to get a little bit more of the tonality that I wanted, and also a bit of the kind of underwater rippley feel. So this is the same composition, duplicated, and then the effects are applied to that, and it's put onto a multiply blending mode. And so as you can see, there's a bit of fractal noise that's giving it a bit of a ripple. And then there's some color effects that are giving it this nice blue color. And just to help with the blending mode, I change the levels to give it a little bit more contrast. And that when we put it back together with the original, you get this sort of nice variation of blues and browns. So that's part one of the background. What about the rest of this? So this is where we start to get into all of these crazy layers. So at the very bottom is that composition we were just looking at. Now on top of that is a watercolor painting that I made. And that looks like this. I've scanned this at really high resolution because I used it in a lot of different ways. And I actually did a fair bit of manipulation in Photoshop as well with this image before bringing it in here. Okay, so you can see those triangles kind of there in the background, and that also has been applied on top of the sand plants with a multiply effect. So it's sort of like building textures. And then let's look again at all of these layers. So what's next? So here we have a lot of video footage. And this is what one of these looks like. So this is stuff that I shot. If I go through it fast, you can see there's sort of this spreading of watery ink on glass. So this again is trying to get that feeling of depth and the way that water moves, which let's see, there's some more of these floating splotches. What's that look like? Here we go. What I really liked about some of this was just all these little bit of textural elements and stuff. And it gives, there's like these little bits of things floating in the water. And you can see that I've sort of masked out everything except for the parts that I find really interesting and given it a lot of feather so that it can blend in really well with the background. If we go back to the composition, that's what you're seeing here. So all these little bubbles and bits of texture are actually moving across the screen. So I've done a fair bit of masking to make sure that they are just showing up in the places that I want. And this footage that I shot, I kind of reused throughout the film in different ways, making it go in different directions, using different parts of the footage. And so you can see here that some of them are composited with a multiply blending mode and others are linear burn. It really just depended on what looked best to me. I also did some manipulation with the curves on some of these to make them sort of pop out and stand out in the right way. I did some color tinting on some of them. So it was a lot of just trial and error, figuring out what looked right in the right spot. Where are we now? So we've got our plants, we've got our triangles, we've got the inky stuff, and then there's just a few more layers of bubbles, and I think these are mostly here. Where are they? There they are. These are mostly here just to also accentuate the fish's movement, and I didn't bother to pre-compose them at this point because I was pretty much done and just adding some more. There's one of my favorite ink blotches, this thing that is rising up from the bottom here. I think that's so cool. The last thing is, so yes, we need to talk a little bit more about getting the fish into this environment. So on top of all of that background, I have one adjustment layer, which if you turn off, you can see it's just really to kind of like make it pop. And then on top of that is the fish, as well as this strange little layer here that you can see it better if I flick it off and on. It's almost like this little ghostly shadow of the fish. So what this layer does is it allows me to composite the fish into the scene without having to use keying, because with sand animation, particularly with these very feathery edges here, it's really difficult to get a clean key that doesn't have a little halo around it. So my solution was to take the composition that I had created with this fish and I rendered it out as a frame sequence, And then I processed it through a Photoshop batch processing to make it look like this. And essentially what this is it's the exact animation, but it has a bit of, it's like it's been eaten away. So it leaves the edges free, but it makes the interior more solid. And so this was a whole effects stack that I applied in After Effects that got this look. And what that ends up looking like is I can use that as an underlayer that I can use as a screen. And let's see if I have any opacity. Yeah, it's only at 50% opacity. Like I could make it brighter if I wanted to and really make that fish pop out. But I kind of felt like, well, a little bit of that watery tint to it is probably a good thing. So I left that at 50%. Well, first of all, it's inverted. Then that layer is then screened onto the background. And then I can use a multiply and I still get this really nice edging from the sand because the multiply is combining those dark pixels with the background. But what I'm getting on the inside where there's all this nice color that I've hand tinted is a little bit more vibrancy and brightness because it's multiplying onto a brighter, more white background than it would be if it was just going onto the background in general. As you can see, everything turns a little bit green unless that layer is there. So that really kind of like gave it that sort of pop that I was looking for, that really colorful, beautiful look of the whole scene that makes the fish just sort of stand out. So that's it. Those are all the secrets. And as you can see, there was a lot of work involved, a lot of experimentation also to get to this stage and figure out how to problem solve each of those individual steps. So I hope this gives you some inspiration to maybe go find your own solutions to the problems that are specific to the materials you are working with. Thanks a lot for watching.